I want to talk about the finance minister's budget presentation and the budget debate on a whole, which I thought was substantive. I think the 5 speeches we heard got us thinking about important things. Only the most curmudgeonly will say they didn't hear a path forward and that they didn't hear alternatives or an alternative approach to the one set out by the government. We did hear that from the opposition. And in true debate form, the finance minister came to rebut what she felt was a misalignment of thought from the opposition. And in doing so, she put the seal on what I thought was a good quality debate for the 26-27 fiscal year. The finance minister said some things yesterday that I think bears looking at, because for me, there were some things that advanced my understanding, and I would assume that it perhaps would advance yours if you got the time to in detail look at it like I did. And in putting the seal on the debate, she tackled head on 2 of the big points made by the opposition in their contribution. Well, 3 big points. One big point was the e-invoicing argument, which the analysts say sounded good. After the initial reaction, and sometimes we're unfair to our analysts because they're analyzing in the moment and they don't get to really digest certain things. I mean, processing information, it is a peristaltic process. It has to go through the phases, like food goes through the gut and comes out you know where. It has to be processed, and then of course the nutrients remain and the waste goes. But we call on them so quickly that sometimes they don't get to the information doesn't go through that peristaltic process. So we get something initially that isn't as strong as it ought to have been. Later, we heard from some other analysts that the e-invoicing, it would need at least a technological infrastructure that would take some time to be built. And that's what's caused many of us to say, all right, good idea, but not immediate term yielding the kind of revenue that the government needs to plug the gap in the budget. The finance minister took that on. So that the e-invoicing, one big punch from the opposition that was tackled. The other one concerned the digital nomads idea, which the finance minister addressed frontally. And then thirdly was the opposition leader's argument that 2% of GDP, where compliance could translate into that and work it to about 60 billion, that he could find $60 billion in the budget just by compliance alone. And the finance minister's response was classic. Let's take them one by one in the time we have. The finance minister, by the way, Julian Robinson's e-invoicing point was grounded. He mentioned countries where e-invoicing had taken place or was in place, the yield from the e-invoicing arrangement, how that streamlined the payment process, and of course, more critically, how that redounded to create revenue for the governments implementing the e-invoicing, electronic invoicing, yeah? The finance minister said, well, that will take 2 to 3 years to come on stream in Jamaica. So the opposition leader opposition spokesman on finance is misguided if he believes that e-invoicing will bring us the revenue we need in the new fiscal year, because 2 to 3 years down the line is when this thing is most likely to yield results. So that's a non-starter where the finances for the next fiscal year are concerned. And remember, the almighty battle between the government and the opposition was between the government's stated intention to rake in at least 20-odd billion from the NHT and the revenue-raising measures, 29 billion from the NHT and other revenue-raising measures in the tax package to help plug the gap in the budget. The opposition is saying, well, we don't believe in any drawdown from the NHT, so forgo that. Do not tax. There exists other money to help plug the gap and of course do some borrowing to supplement that. So that's fundamentally what the budget debate rested around: the financing of the plans that the government has, the government's approach to financing, and the opposition's alternative plan to financing the budget. So e-invoicing, the finance minister said it's a good idea, but it can't be implemented in time to give us even a dollar in the new fiscal year, and we need all the dollars we can get. And she brought a chart that showed that the number of years for rollout of e-invoicing across Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Peru, Italy, India, Colombia, Uruguay, Ecuador, Spain, Hungary, Poland, Saudi Arabia, and Romania, all in excess of 2 years. In the case of Chile, at least 7 to 10 years. And I think Chile was one of the examples used by the opposition spokesman on finance. So she said it took 7 to 10 years for them to get it up and running. Yeah, we need the revenue now. So we can't talk about something that is a credible funding option when it will yield no revenue in the fiscal year now. So she, I believe, torpedoed that point. Then the point about digital nomads. Of course, you heard Barbados announce during COVID that people were to come from overseas, work in Barbados, enjoy a lot of benefits. And these digital nomads, the revenue that they would generate from their activities and everything else could be put into a kitty to help to support the government's spending plans over the course of a fiscal year. Fayval Williams says, yes, well, it's a good medium-term idea, but it is, of course, a broader strategy to diversify Jamaica's visitor economy, to attract long-stay remote workers and stimulate spending in select sectors. However, she said, it cannot be held up as a sufficiently robust revenue measure because there are so many implementation hurdles that need to be crossed that you could not predicate your finances on a digital nomad system that has not yet been set up. She said it would be madness to forego certain revenue from the NHT, forego certain revenue from taxation, and hang your hat on a stick that is built on digital nomads revenue and e-invoicing revenue when neither of those two can be implemented in even 1 year. And she said there are so many uncertainties around the digital nomad thing that, you'd have to set that up and see what it yields down the road, but you could never budget on those things. And that was the crux of her argument. She went further and she said some things about the BOJ and the drawdown from the BOJ of an additional $1 billion as proposed by the opposition spokesman on finance. And she gave a lesson in how governments can draw down from the BOJ, given, of course, the BOJ is now an independent entity. It wasn't always so. Legislation was passed under a Labour Party administration to make it, to give it degrees of separation between central government, and no longer you had a finance minister with the power to call and direct the BOJ to do something. Legislation is in place to prevent that from happening. Fayval Williams said, look, let me further state that in addition to the guardrails around dividends from the Bank of Jamaica to the government, any lending by the BOJ to the government cannot exceed 5% of the average of the government's recurrent revenue over the previous 3 years, and it has to be repaid no later than 4 months after the end of the fiscal year that the payment was in. And she says, a national emergency would have to be declared by the minister and ratified by Parliament before the BOJ can lend to the government. So a lot of properties, it's not just BOJ send 1 billion come. That's not how it works, she said. And this is just a part of the lesson she gave in the relationship between government and the BOJ and how the government can access funds from the central bank. And she said, Madam Speaker, in terms of foreign currency, if the government wants foreign currency from the Bank of Jamaica, it can't order the BOJ to send the foreign currency. The government has to buy it. And that's something that was told to us by the senior vice president of the BOJ when he spoke to us in that important lesson about the NIR. Yeah. So she says it can't work like that. And of course, she went into the politics, said the maths isn't mathsing and so forth. So essentially what she was saying is that, look, if we remove the 11.4 billion that the government is taking from the NHT and remove the 18 billion that they're taking in tax packet, in the tax measures, and replace it with two uncertainties that will not yield a dollar, none of them until at least 2-3 years down the line. How do we run a country with that approach? And that's essentially what Fayval Williams was saying. I also found instructive her response to the leader of the opposition about the revenues that he had identified. And she said, Madam Speaker, on the part of the leader of the opposition, he said he identified revenues of about 2% of GDP from compliance. She said the government's projected GDP. Remember, Golding said he had identified revenues of about 2% of GDP from just compliance measures being implemented alone, 2% of GDP. She told the parliament that the government's GDP for the fiscal year 26-27 is $3,857 billion. And so 2% of that would be approximately 77 billion. And then she asked the question, which I believe is one of the most important questions asked in this debate. She said, Madam Speaker, if the opposition leader identified $77 billion of new revenue from compliance, why then would the opposition spokesman on finance need to borrow any money at all to fund the budget? And I don't think that that's a question that the opposition could answer, because that question is unanswerable. That question is supreme, because then, obviously, why would Julian Robinson as finance minister need to, if we're to take his alternative approach to financing the budget at face value, why would he need to borrow $1 if on their calculation and their assessment, there exists 77 billion, or let's use the opposition leader's lower figure of 60 billion to rake in from strict compliance measures alone? Why would you need $1 of debt financing to fund the budget? Is the question Fayval Williams asked, and it's a question that could not be answered. And you know, when you look at it, she said, listen, this suggests lack of coordination between the opposition leader and the finance minister. One talking about taxing to plug a gap in the budget, and the other saying there is an excess amount of funds above the level that my finance minister would borrow to fund the budget that I have identified. The two of them don't work. It don't make sense. There is a lack of congruence between the points made by the two gentlemen on the opposition side, which is what the finance minister called out. But I think at the end of the day, Jamaica won, because we heard and saw thinking from the opposition. We heard points put down, admittedly, as revealed by the finance minister, not things that can be implemented immediately. And if anybody thinks that she's being facetious by saying e-invoicing and the digital nomad thing can't be implemented immediately to yield revenue, you're mistaken. She's not being facetious. It's not a fallacy. It's a fact. They cannot. It's impossible for them to yield the takings that the opposition says. And then she pointed to the flaw. So I'm saying that we as spectators, we benefited because we heard point and counterpoint, ideas, alternative, a plan of action, and another approach to getting to the destination. And we now have a full understanding of how the budget will be financed, what are the financing options available, and how the government intends to manage these resources over the new fiscal year as it moves from resilience, from rebuilding to resilience, from resilience to resurgence, as it helps the country to build back from Hurricane Melissa. So to Golding, Robinson, Holness, and Fayval Williams, the country benefited from the budget exercise just completed, is my submission this morning.